that the administration not commit the transgression that I would argue we committed over the course of many years working on this issue, but particularly during the fraught period 1999 to 2000 at Camp David, which in my serious effort by an empowered American president, Palestinian leader, and Israeli prime minister to actually tackle these issues in a sustained and serious way with all its limitation, but not to call it a transgression or the mistake that we made in trivializing the issues, not just Jerusalem, all of the permanent status issues. The fact that everybody knows, quote unquote, where this solution is going may provide some measure of comfort to those who have not had experience in an actual negotiation with real live Israelis and Palestinians. But it is of no comfort and very little utility to the will and skill that is actually required to deal with these issues. These are torturously, galactically complicated issues. And diplomats can come up with any number of clever fixes to solve them. But in the end, it requires the kind of political will on the part of Israelis and Palestinians and Americans that we've not yet seen. So, housekeeping. Each of our distinguished panelists will speak for 10 minutes, no more. I will enforce that rigorously. They're all forewarned. Danny will address the situation on the ground in Jerusalem and assess the government of Israel's current policy and position in negotiation. Raith, who has had a lot of experience on the PLO's negotiating team, will talk about Jerusalem as an issue in negotiation and assess the PA's position. And Art, who's got tremendous experience, both in Israel, as former ambassador to Yemen, we could talk about that, Art, for a long time, and has been involved with the Canadians in an extraordinary project which is now available for the world to see, and Art can tell you more about that, about what would happen if, in fact, you could find parties seriously interested and willing to commit themselves to try to solve the problem. So, with that, I may ask an annoyingly negative question when they're done, and then we'll go to your questions. Danny?
Thank you. Thank you for hosting this. Exactly 50 years ago, on June 6, 1967, Moshe Dayan went on top of the library building on Mount Scopus, overlooking the old city. Israel had already been engaged in hostilities in the West Bank, more or less taking the West Bank, and there was a debate raging, do we take the old city? And Dayan is quoted as saying, what the hell do we need all of this Vatican for? 24 hours go by, and Dayan is standing on Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, and says, we have returned to the sacred sites of the Jewish people, never to take leave of them. What a difference a day makes. The kernel of the current realities in Jerusalem were present in 1967. 2 weeks after the war, we annexed the land of East Jerusalem. We did not annex the population. We did not offer citizenship. The Palestinians did not want citizenship. You will be told that the Palestinians are entitled to become citizens of Israel. They're not. They're entitled to ask. We're entitled to say no. They don't ask, and we say no. Today, from the outset, Jerusalem became a binational city in 1967. It is much more of a binational city today. 37% of the population is Palestinian as opposed to 25% in 1967. And it's not only the fact that it's a binational city and becoming more binational, it is a binational city at the epicenter of a global, regional, and local conflict in which you have two national collectives, one of which is politically empowered and the other is permanently disempowered. And that is the central fact of life in Jerusalem. And that cannot be reformed, that cannot be changed, it cannot be lubricated, it only can be ended. Point number one. Point number two. I would like to show you all of the embassies in Israeli Jerusalem right here and now. Would you like to see them again? There's not one embassy, not in East Jerusalem, not in West Jerusalem. Most remarkable, not only did President Trump not move the embassy as he promised, He came and went, left Jerusalem and stayed on script, unheard of, but it happened, and did not change longstanding American policy on this. I am by no means sanguine in this regard. I think that it's quite possible that 6 months or a year from now, that position will change. And if the United States moves its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, it will not unite Jerusalem. It will not legitimate Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. The United States will simply disqualify itself as any role of broker in the Middle East. Jerusalem today is more contested than at any point since 1967. Next, the undivided capital of Israel. Undivided, Jerusalem today is more divided than ever before since 1967. Israelis do not venture into East Jerusalem, full stop. Palestinians are apprehensive of going to West Jerusalem because in my local cafe, the proprietor Israeli and all of the baristas are Palestinian, and he will not send them to the dumpster at night because there are vigilantes on the streets of Jerusalem picking on Palestinians. Today, the patterns of movement are exactly where the border would have been had you been successful at Camp David. I am an eccentric Israeli who spent most of the Second Intifada with my buddies in the Shuafat refugee camp and places like that. I cannot go into 90% of East Jerusalem without assuming physical risks I'm unwilling to assume. My Palestinian friends will say, by all means, come visit us, but we will pick you up at the entrance to the neighborhood. What is the Israeli response to this? I will give you the response of official Israel and then two other official responses. The response of official Israel goes back to Moshe Dayan. And this is an article of faith that is impervious to empirical reality. Jerusalem is as it should be under sole Israeli sovereignty. In the last 3 years, Israel has arrested or detained almost 10% of the Palestinian boys between the ages of 12 and 18 in clashes with the police. And we will break them. We will break their will because these are bad people, because only bad people rebel against the optimal. The forces of moderation in Israel, quote unquote, will say, let's get rid of another 100,000 Palestinians by putting up a wall. Herzog. And then the progressive forces are saying, they're in revolt because we haven't built sewers in schools. True, we haven't built sewers in schools, but that is not what this is about. This is about the fact, the clear sense that the Palestinians of East Jerusalem are a population adrift, abandoned by the Arab world, abandoned by Ramallah, treated as the enemy by Israel. Palestinian lives in East Jerusalem don't matter. This is about occupation. And the greatest existential challenge, according to Tamir Pardo, to the Jewish people is identical with the greatest existential challenge of the Palestinian people. That is occupation. That is the threat that we share. Occupation ends in one way. Occupation ends in a border, and that border will be in Jerusalem. And there is absolutely no indication of that happening in the immediate future. This round of violence is probably dying down. The periods between each successive round of violence will become shorter because none of the underlying issues have been addressed. Each successive round will become more violent in a cyclical pattern. At this point, I usually hear, it can't go on this way, and then I hear a voice inside my head saying, you're damn right it can, and the voice is the voice of Aaron Miller. Of course it can go on this way. Having said that, and I'm summing up, sometimes living in Jerusalem is like living in Los Angeles. You can feel the pressure on the tectonic plates building under your feet. And we are living in a bubble, in an acute state of disequilibrium, and at some point this will right itself, and we'll arrive at a new state of equilibrium, either through robust political engagement, which is not going to happen, or a catastrophic and likely violent event. And that may not happen in the next 6 months, but it probably won't take 6 years. And the day after that round of violence dies down, whether it's in Jerusalem with the Hezbollah or elsewhere, after we finish the body count, we'll be back to the same dilemmas and probably go back into a low-grade fever.
All right, so Danny, you finished 4 minutes early. So I'm going to change the format some and ask you a question. Meron Ben-Venisti argued during the late 80s, that it was 5 minutes to midnight with respect to the possibilities of a solution. What you've seen in Jerusalem, can you say and argue that a point of no return with respect to facts on the ground, not facts up here necessarily, they're two different sets of facts, has been reached? That is to say,
Okay,
with will, and maybe you can recount some of the changes
Okay.
briefly,
okay.
is there still a solution that might satisfy Israelis and Palestinians?
I have to distinguish between the answer to the question in Jerusalem and the answer all over West Bank. In Jerusalem, emphatically, the two-state solution is alive because the border exists. Almost precisely where the border would go were this to be negotiated in good faith, and we know that that's not in the cards. But were there to be negotiations, it would not be the creation of a new border, but fleshing out an existing border. Most Israelis and most Palestinians would not change the way they live or go to work were there to be a politically divided city, even a physically divided city. That is not the case in terms of the way that Jerusalem is integrated into the West Bank. Today, we know with unprecedented clarity what the zone of possible agreement, conceivably, where that is between an Israeli and a Palestinian, if there were to be negotiations in good faith. There are certain borders that the Palestinians cannot be bludgeoned into accepting. There are certain borders that Israel can't be bludgeoned. And once you define that, you know that it's a 3 to 4% land swap. Since we know where the border goes, we also know how many settlers will need to be relocated in order to arrive at that border. When Netanyahu assumed office, that number was 116,000. Today, that number is 156,000. It is going up by 5 to 10,000 a year. If Israel has the will and the capacity to relocate 156,000 settlers, the two-state solution is alive. If we don't, it's dead. Israel clearly has the capacity to relocate that number. We absorbed more than 1 million immigrants from the former Soviet Union. We do not have the will to relocate one settler. So at the moment, I can give you the definitive question. I cannot give you the definitive answer. In some ways, it's a bit like crossing the Pacific Ocean in an ocean liner without any navigation equipment. You're going to cross the international date line. It's really consequential. It's inevitable that you're going to cross it. One side of the line is yesterday. The other side of the line is tomorrow, but you're not going to know when you cross it.
Very well said. Brutally honest. Nate, we'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much. And really, thank you, Aaron, for giving me the chance to go away from the complexity of reality on the ground to move to the equally difficult but slightly more sanitized world of negotiations and diplomacy. But before that, I want to actually emphasize a point that Danny mentioned. Among Palestinians in East Jerusalem, there is a major drift, there is a sense of abandonment, there is no trust or true attachment to the Palestinian political process and political leadership and political structures, which will make it very difficult if we ever get to a point of reaching a diplomatic agreement, which will include compromises, to sell these kind of compromises to that alienated population that we have there. So this is a trend that is disturbing, that's ongoing, and as of yet, I see no attempt to reverse it. That said, let me move to the more orderly world of negotiations. And here, I would say, while I would agree with you, Aaron, that we do not know the solution. If we knew the solution, we will have it. And ultimately, it's a political issue. But years and years of negotiations and books, etc., and memoirs written have given us a sense of what are the issues that have to be decided, what are the decisions that will have to be made by the leaders, and what are the options that they have at their disposal to actually reach these kind of decisions. And in that sense, Jerusalem is really about three distinct issues that we need to negotiate. One is actually the territorial aspect of Jerusalem. What do you do with the city? An urban space, what do you do with that? And that entails a number of questions. The one is, should it be divided, or should it, in sovereignty-wise, should it be divided or should it be united? The Israeli position clearly is it's a united city. For the Palestinians, it is a red line, in my view, that Jerusalem has to be decided. There has to be a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem. Absent that, I don't see a Palestinian leader who has a political capacity, let alone interest, in actually foregoing this one. Abbas in particular is quite sensitive about this issue because of a document dating to the late 90s called the Abu Mazen, that's Abbas's nom de guerre, Balin agreement, in which it was claimed that Abbas has agreed to a Palestinian capital outside Jerusalem in some villages, which made him even more sensitive to this issue. So I don't see a solution acceptable on the Palestinian side without the division of sovereignty in Jerusalem. If we accept there's a division in sovereignty, the question then becomes, along what lines? How do we divide Jerusalem? And the solution to this, I think, where theoretically there is consensus, is it's what you guys did during the Clinton era. Jewish neighborhoods become part of Israel, Arab neighborhoods become part of Palestine. Not very easy politically for the Palestinians to give up any part of East Jerusalem, but I think there is enough understanding that this is how it has to go. A third question that sometimes arises, okay, we have this division, and we have it on the map, but can't we have an open city? On the map, there's a division of sovereignty. In reality, we have an open city. It's a very nice idea. It's a very humanistic idea. The problem with this is that in reality, to create this open city, there are too many security and economic complications in terms of creating a huge gap in what should be a sealed two-state solution, separation, that much as it is a nice idea, I just don't see how this can be done in reality. But ultimately, on the territorial aspect, if it is not divided, there's no deal from a Palestinian perspective. If it's divided, it will have to be a physical division along demographic lines. We move to the next aspect of Jerusalem. So there's the territorial. You zoom in and we get to the next more complicated issue, which is the old city of Jerusalem, or often referred to as the Holy Basin, which is the old city and some of the surrounding ideas. I'm not going to go into great detail about this because I think Art has done a lot of work on it, but all I would have to say is the following. From a negotiation perspective, the Palestinian preference is for it to be divided in terms of sovereignty. On the map, you can see that the Muslim, Christian, and Armenian quarters will become Palestinian sovereignty. The Jewish quarter will become Israeli sovereignty. However, in reality, it's impossible to divide that piece of land. Too rich in history, religion, etc., and it will have to be an open city. And I think this is what you guys worked on in the Canadian project. Finally, the most complicated issue in Jerusalem is that one part inside the old city, which is in Hebrew, is it Har Habayit? Is that how you pronounce it? In Arabic, Al-Haram al-Sharif. We'll call it the Temple Mount for our purposes here. And on that one, the almost counterintuitive aspect of it is that in terms of how it's going to be run, irrespective of how you resolve it, there's not much controversy. Since Israel took control in 1967, the situation has been that Muslim authorities have been running the Muslim sites, Jewish authorities have been running the Jewish aspects of that site, and both sides, I believe, certainly the Palestinians, understand that no matter how sovereignty is going to be divided and resolved, there will be huge limitations on what either side can do on that site. No digging, security restrictions, etc. And the religious sites will have to be run by the religious authorities of both faiths. The Christians have no claim on that particular part. The real problem is the question of sovereignty. And it became very clear to us negotiators very early on that sovereignty in this case is not simply a legal concept. It is code word for attachment. As we were negotiating sovereignty, we were really negotiating who has more attachment to this site, which led to some of the most infantile conversations I have ever witnessed. One that I remember very clearly, where an Israeli person who I have tremendous respect for, a very thoughtful guy, said to us, oh, we clearly love it more than you. It's mentioned X number of times in the Torah. To which the Palestinians said, it's only mentioned a few times in the Quran, but it's only one of 3 cities mentioned in the Quran. So clearly we love it more than you. Back and forth, this is a question on attachment. And when it comes to attachment, it is impossible to come up with the kind of rational, almost real estate approaches that we talked about in the territorial aspect of the city. There has to be a compromise here. One side will win, one side will lose. Mm-hmm. On this one in particular, though, it is very difficult. You can speak about the Israeli, I can speak about the Palestinian. It is almost impossible for me to see how the Palestinians can actually renounce sovereignty on that. Partly because of the Palestinian and Islamic part of it, but also partly because it is not only a Palestinian issue. On all of the above issues, the Arab countries will simply support what the Palestinians would decide on. On this one in particular, the Arabs, Saudi Arabia, Muslim countries, etc., have a stake. They do want unfettered access, and they want sovereignty. And so this one here, this is, to me, is the real crux of the matter. This is the one that we cannot have creative legal or drafting solutions. A win-lose, and I'm not sure how this one is going to be resolved. One last footnote in all of this. As we look at the issue of Jerusalem and as we discuss it as a bilateral Palestinian-Israeli issue, one component that is key if we want to have a deal is to remember that in any deal, the Jordanians, particularly the Jordanian royal family, has to have a clear, strong presence or part, because Jordan is a guarantor, and without Jordan, I don't see the deal being struck.
Okay, thank you very much. Art?
Okay, thanks very much. You mentioned Dayan. During the negotiations with Egypt, he also said, if there's a choice between Sharm el-Sheikh and an agreement, I'll take Sharm. Well, he didn't carry that day. Maybe his second day can be turned around at some point. Well, I mentioned in particular the question of sovereignty. But you know, the territorial imperative is hard at work, as you just heard. And the fundamental question is who gets what, who owns what? Sovereignty. Is it Israel or Palestine that gets it in the end? And can sovereignty be divided? And that was what Camp David was all about, and what a lot of Track 2 work is all about too. Is it possible to reach a peace deal without sharp decisions on sovereignty? Who gets what? Now, there's been a lot of imaginative thinking done, including actually at Camp David, as some of you guys who were there might remember, because there was understanding this is really a tough situation, so let's put our heads to work here and maybe we can come up with some workarounds. So they came up with supreme sovereignty, I guess, as opposed to lesser sovereignty, suspended, divided, joint, conditional, residual, functional, sovereign custody, autonomous sovereignty, and even divine sovereignty, which a very distinguished Israeli lady who was a winner of the Israeli Prize actually thought, Ruth Lapidote. Was a wonderful lady. I had the pleasure of meeting her. But there's a common denominator in all these efforts, and that is no deal is possible because there are locations where one side or the other simply can't give in. As Danny said, neither side will be bludgeoned into accepting things that just fundamentally, according to their own narratives, their belief systems, or whatever, they can do. It just won't happen. Now, also implicit in all these attempts to redefine sovereignty is understanding that the present status of one side insisting on sovereignty and asserting it by force is not a solution. That will not lead to any peace deal. So the present status of sovereignty for one is not an option that will lead to an agreement. So let's come to divided sovereignty, which I just talked about. There's been the focus of negotiations, a lot of Track 2 work. This is, if you talk about Jerusalem, you talk about the city itself, as Danny said, it's already divided in all kinds of ways. And as he said, the line where an agreement would actually come out is actually a line in the ground now for the most part. But then what about the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif? And I'll come back to that in a minute. Because I think most of you in the room here are probably familiar with the Clinton parameters and then the follow-on negotiations in Taba. And maybe you also follow a little bit the Geneva Initiative, the Geneva Accord, and maybe even some of the work that the Abraham Center has done here in town. And they're all focused on dividing sovereignty as the best available outcome. And of course, this is all available on the web, very easy to take a look at. For the city itself, as I indicated, that's probably doable in the right overall circumstances, and a fundamental decision by both sides that a decision to reach an agreement is in their own national interests, is in their own individual national interest to really do something. So on the city itself, then come back to the old city. For example, just to give you a couple of specific examples, what guys that negotiated would have to think about. The Holy of Holies, which was at the far recess, far end of the temple, in the Temple Mount, was defined as the focus of the divine spirit on earth. And no one knows where it is for sure now, but it is believed to be still under the ground there somewhere. And of course, the Haram is also the point of departure of the prophet to the heavens for his conversation with God. And of course, Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock are still there. So one side said, oh, how do we write off, how do we give up for eternity the place that we believe was the focus of the divine presence on earth? And how does the other side, for the reasons I've said, decide to write it off also for eternity? Now, as I said, the Haram also was not just a Palestinian issue. It's an Arab issue, it's an Islamic issue. It's a Jordanian issue because in the treaty with Israel, also the Israelis said, your needs will be taken into account when there's a final deal reached. And for the Palestinians, that has also a special importance because Palestine is a small country of no particular standing, a lot of reasons because of occupation for 50 years, but if the Palestinians would have control of the Haram, this would give them a special standing in the Arab and Israeli worlds. So that's also at play here. Now, I also mentioned open city. I'll just say specifically, to my way of thinking, the main negative point there is that this would mean that there would have to be security checkpoints going from Israel to Jerusalem and from Palestine to Jerusalem. And I think basically that would be a deal breaker right there. The citizenry, both places, but the Israelis would be the most vocal because they now have free access. So you can write that off as far as I'm concerned. So, but just to come back, so division is an option. Division in the right circumstances is probably possible of the city as a whole. But here's a question. What if there is serious progress on peace process issues, on the other core issues, progress on Jerusalem as a whole, but that's stuck on the old city? And what do? You've got some real progress. How can you allow that to block things? So maybe there's a way that sovereignty can be put to the side in a way that wouldn't affect the claims of either party, yet allow a larger agreement between Israel and Palestine to be reached. And this is a sort of sharing, but not sharing of sovereignty so much as just assigning equal authorities and responsibilities to each, while the position of sovereignty can be kind of de-escalated and cooled off for however long it might take. Now, the Jerusalem Old City Initiative, of which I was an active part, JOCI, is a Canadian Track 2 project that has done a very deep, deep dive into what a special regime for the Old City might look like, how it could be set up, how it could be administered, how it could be run, how it could be supervised, until a definitive agreement could be reached. Now, as you know, the Appeal Commission in 37 and UN Resolution 181 and 47 would have provided for a special regime for Jerusalem and the environs, but it would have been really an internationalization of which a special regime would be imposed on the area. And as you probably all also know, special regimes have been talked about to some extent in negotiations and talks starting with Camp David in 2000. Now, JOCI is suggesting a different kind of special regime. It's a special regime that the two parties, Israel and a new state of Palestine, would create in their treaty, in their PSA. So it would be created by the parties themselves, and it would be their special regime. They would own it. It would not be imposed. And they would have responsibility for oversight of the special regime, although they would not run it on a day-to-day basis. The idea is in their PSA, they would include a detailed mandate, and also they would ask for the endorsement of the Security Council. The special regime would be governed by a board made up of Israel and a new state of Palestine, and others that the two might decide to invite. Maybe Jordan because their special role. Some people thought, well, maybe Morocco because they're in the Palestine chair in the Organization of the Islamic Conference. Whoever the two would want, it would be up to them. The board, as I said, would not govern the old city on a day-to-day basis, but appoint a chief administrator who would have that with the mandate spelling out in very great detail exactly what those responsibilities are and where they were not. There would be a religious council set up to provide guidance on access and worship at holy sites, which could also just continue under present administration. As Guy pointed out, the religious entities now do that, or whatever the two parties might decide together. And there will also be a special police service, not including Israelis or Palestinians except as unarmed community liaison officers. Now, all of the work being done is being published by Routledge in 3 publications, three volumes. The first one is out. I don't get any commission, but I think it's worth reading because a lot of very serious work by Israelis, Palestinians, and others with very deep experience went into all of this. So I was asked to say, what about the options? Well, asserting sovereignty by force of arms is not an option because it won't lead to peace. The second, clean divisions of sovereignty, unsuccessful in the past, but I think one can see how that should also be on the table. And then, finally, if some progress is made and the deal is just being held up by what do you do with the old city and what do you do with the holy sites, there is an option which I think has a lot to offer it. Now, just one last word as a Josie member. When we'd go around and talk to people, and we were very happy that virtually nobody refused to see us. In Israel or Palestine or here in town or in London or in Bonn or Berlin, people were listening. When Michael Bell and I went to see the rabbi of the Western Wall and the holy sites, Rabbi Shmuel Rabinovich, he made 2 points to us. He said, first, Ben-Gurion was a genius. He accepted what was possible and built on it. And second, the way the holy sites are run now is not perfect, not what we would wish in a perfect situation, but it works. Don't mess with it. I said, oh, Rabbi, if you read our stuff, you will find nothing in here that would be contrary to those wishes. So thank you very much.
Art, thank you very much.
There's one other option, that is a one-state solution, but we won't deal with that today.
Before we go to your questions, we have about 20 minutes. Just would say make two brief comments. Number one, history here is not an ally of a rational, negotiated solution. I mean, if you looked at the way history has dealt with Jerusalem and those who have contested over it, it strikes me that the dominating theme was that Jerusalem was never designed to be shared by anyone. Its strategic imperative, or the prime directive, was that Jerusalem should be possessed by the nation, by the tribe, or by one confessional group's vision of their divine and their God. On the positive side, it strikes me, though, keying off Art's final remark, that the only way to address permanent status is from the perspective of a package in which there are trade-offs within issues and trade-offs between issues, where a certain amount of flexibility on a territorial or an identity issue, and Jerusalem is both an identity issue and a territorial issue, can somehow be compensated for movement in another issue. And this requires, when you talk about the ultimate deal, the grand bargain, that basically is it. And Art's point that if in fact the problem of divine and overlapping sacred space, Har HaBayit, Haram HaSharif, remains the final issue, which it is likely to remain the final issue, perhaps there is some hope, having gotten that far, that a mediator or the parties themselves can find a way through. So we have about 25 minutes for questions. Please, no station identification, please, other than identifying yourselves, and ask your question. Yes, down here in the front.
Netra Halpern Peace Films. Yeah, I was saying the independent regime, in a way, it's like DC in the sense that it's between Virginia and Maryland. Ben, you talked about security checkpoints before. So when people came from Palestine in, would that be a security checkpoint, and likewise from Israel?
That's right. And I mentioned our Palestinian and Israeli collaborators. We had people from the Palestinian security forces, some active, some who had been in the past. We had former Mossad and Shin Bet and Jerusalem police senior officers, a former commander. We hired a architectural company to design how you could get a maximum number of people through the Jaffa Gate and make it architecturally compatible with the rest of the city and so forth. And it can be done. It can be done. And in the security paper that was done by, after a lot of collaboration and consultation with our Israeli and Palestinian partners, done by two Canadians and myself, a former deputy commissioner of the RCMP and General John de Chastelain, who was in charge, the co-chair of the Northern Ireland arrangements. And we all think it can be done. But the point is that you've got to have a system so when it's first put into effect that both Israel and Palestine and the citizenries have confidence that the security system will work. So that means that there would be the capability of going, all hands on deck, and other time relax it to a certain extent later on when people have confidence and things work in. But the answer to your question is yes, there would be.
Yes.
Hi, Stephen Stern. There seemed to be general agreement in one way or another that on the ground, the city of Jerusalem itself, except for the Holy Basin, there's something on the ground that could lead to a solution. Holy Basin being intractable but some ideas for that. Danny, you mentioned the integration of what's happening in Jerusalem into the land swaps that you imagine. Could you and maybe Reith say a little more on how that integration of what's happening in Jerusalem, where you say the border will be set, and what's happening on the West Bank, how that would, what that means going forward?
I want to take you to a visual lookout point, a virtual lookout point, something I do rather often in Jerusalem. Standing on the area between Mount Scopus and the Mount of Olives, between the Hebrew University and Augusta Victoria, looking out over the desert. And you look out there and you can see Ma'ale Dumim, the third largest settlement in the West Bank. And the common wisdom is that Ma'ale Dumim will be integrated into Israel in the framework of land swaps. I think that's a reasonable assumption. But what would Olmert say, who negotiated the two-state solution, and what would Abbas say standing at that point? Olmert would look out and say that, look, I really am earnest about getting to a two-state outcome, and I can't dismantle Ma'ale Dumim. And look out there, it's desert. Be pragmatic, be moderate. Let's split the difference, okay? And that approach sort of reflects the Bush letter to Sharon on the demographic and the geographic realities. Abbas would stand there and say, before we look out there, let's turn around and look at West Jerusalem and into Israel proper. That's ours too. And the deal is, we waive our claims from 1948, but we get everything out there. And every grain of sand out there in the desert is ours, and every tile built in a home in Ma'ale Dumim is illegal. It's contrary to international law. So you have the facts on the ground-based approach, and you have the rights-based approach. Oil and water, completely incompatible, and it's a gap you will never bridge. Now, no Israeli prime minister that I could envisage will accept dismantling a city of 40,000 people. It's just simply not going to happen. And I cannot imagine any Palestinian leader who's going to take Olmert's approach and say, build one and accept a fragmented, fractured, discontiguous Palestinian state. And neither is going to be bludgeoned on that. And that hones in on a question. How is it possible to convincingly link Ma'ale Dumim to Israel proper in a way that may be detrimental to the contiguity of a Palestinian state, but not devastating? And when you give those guidelines to a cartographer, they know what to do. There may not be one solution how to do it, but there aren't three, maybe one and a half, two. And that is the zone of possible agreement when you understand the logic. Now, this would require pushing the envelope, two courageous national leaders negotiating in good faith, willing to move out of their political and ideological bunkers to adjust their interpretation. Olmert thought he did it. Olmert, in his hospital room today, but prison cell today, knows he didn't go the distance. And I think left to his own devices now would be very close to that.
Danny, you're good for the soul and spirit.
Mine.
Yes, second row.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Julian Kyle Lewis. I study international education policy at the American University here in D.C. And I guess to put to you very seriously, historically, is there any moment that you can think of over the course of the past 100 years of trying to solve this issue that something came up that affected the situation in such a vast manner that both sides weren't expecting that to happen, and that both sides had to react in some way to their own benefit, whether they work together or work separately? Was there anything that you could think of that it seemed like, oh, well, this is out of both of our hands, and we just had to react the way we reacted? Just, if it's anything you can think of, think really, really hard. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I could quickly just address this.
Mhm.
There have been three breakthroughs, not necessarily transformative, but three breakthroughs in the history of the Arab-Israeli peace process. All of them, without exception, were preceded by a intriguing and intricate joining of pain on one hand and the prospects of gain on the other. That is what moves leaders who are genuinely fearful of making decisions. Sadat and Rabin are examples of that. The ultimate existential price, which both paid for what they did. It is pain and gain that have explained all of the breakthroughs. Kissinger's 3 disengagement agreements, Sadat's trip to Jerusalem, the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, which was the byproduct of another breakthrough, Oslo, which was itself preceded by insurgency and violence, and even Madrid, which was made possible by Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. So that is the effective combination. We've had plenty of pain, but it has never been transformative enough since the last breakthrough, accompanied by willful, purposeful leaders who could also create gain. That is what you need. It's a sad commentary, but I can't imagine any other combination moving this particular process forward. Faith?
I mean, I agree with you just to say that pain and gain are not enough if you don't have leadership. We had many moments of plenty of pain in this conflict, a few moments of opportunity. What I think we lack right now are leaders. I mean, I look on the Palestinian side, and I certainly look at President Abbas, and he doesn't have the political capital for this. And I look at the political process on the Palestinian side, and I don't see it producing the kind of leader. Actually, I see the opposite. I see an erosion of Palestinian political institutions and legitimacy, and that's problematic. And I look on the Israeli side, not my expertise yet. I certainly don't see the leader there. I don't see the leader in the making who will do that. So objective factors are not enough if you don't have that subjective moment, and you can combine the two.
I'd like to add something to the mix. I think that Israelis and Palestinians suffer from two similar collective psychological disorders. Israelis are in a state of clinical denial. Occupation, what occupation? Shelley Yachimowicz, the former head of our opposition, saying, occupation? What are you talking about? My kids serve in the West Bank, and they're really good kids. Tel Aviv, if you don't see it, it doesn't exist. We're sipping cappuccino on the edge of a volcano. Palestinians are not in clinical denial, but clinical depression. 24 years after Oslo, we are not 1 inch closer to the end of occupation. Politics is incapable of delivering. And I think that the international community has helped both Israelis and Palestinians to arrive at that situation and to cultivate occupation denial in Israel by failing to tell us and things you can do things on the cheap. Deus ex machina is not going to come from people like you. It's not going to come from Washington. But without robust and very firm engagement from the international community, you are not going to see the emergence of the kind of leadership that we need. The goal of international engagement is not to replace the will of the parties, but to put Israelis and Palestinians to what I call a stress test, to make us confront the realities. And it has been the policy of the governments in this town successively to fund our crack addiction to occupation rather than to sending us to rehab.
That would be grounds for a whole nother panel, but maybe we'll actually reconvene at some point. Okay, who's next? We have time for several more questions.
Where was the inspiration there?
Yes.
Thank you so much for your interesting and thoughtful presentations. My name is Abraham Avidor, retired Foreign Service, and 50 years ago I happened to serve as a young lieutenant in the Israeli Armed Forces. So after the war, there was a great deal of euphoria, which was later on turned into, when the reality was set in, to frustration and realism and so on. But my question relates to what was just mentioned here, to what can realistically be expected now from a peace agreement when the hardliners on both sides control the agenda, when the two sides don't trust each other, and the two sides also insist on preferences, the Jews because of the Holocaust, I mentioned the denial and a complex, and the Palestinians because of the occupation. And in addition to Jerusalem, which was thoroughly discussed here, there are also the issues of water rights, refugees, and borders. So what can realistically be expected out of this agreement? Thank you.
Well, I've already weighed in an annoyingly negative manner. Does someone else want to take this question? Graith, I think you might be the most likely.
Look, I mean, first of all, I would not discount surprises. I would not discount the role of an American president who would, as Danny said, put the sides to the stress test, meaning there are decisions to be made and there's a cost to not making these kind of decisions. I will not discount all of that. That's always a possibility. We have to wait and see. Yet, I just don't see at the moment the sides, even under this kind of stress test, being able to reach these kind of major compromises. So the question right now is there anything less than these major compromises that can be done to stabilize? That's one question. The other question, of course, is can you come up with a policy that will force the sides to take a series of decisions that will force them to confront their domestic politics and to shift their domestic politics. We actually had a precedent of this during your times, during the Clinton time, at the White River negotiations, which were designed in a way that forced the Israeli side at that point to make decisions and Bibi to confront his domestic politics or not. That's a possibility. But both of these options require time, require patience, and will not produce a glitzy signing ceremony that everyone will go home and be happy with. This requires patience, and we do not know yet if this administration has the staying power and the patience to engage in something like this.
Additional thoughts? Yes, I think I see a hand.
Hello, my name is Carlene Fisher, and I'm wondering what would be the possibility if Israel and Palestine gave up their religious sites to the United Nations to oversee as a neutral zone and allow other people to rule, and they can be part of it, but they're not the only ones. And if that does not work, what would be the problem with it?
I mean, we tried insane and irrational fixes at the last Camp David summit. Among them were according sovereignty above ground to the Israelis and below ground to the, I'm sorry, above ground to the Palestinians and below ground to the Israelis, which seemed to a bunch of American rationalists as a wonderfully creative fix. Who could reject that? We even thought, but didn't propose, since it was overlapping divine sacred space, taking sovereignty away from both sides, because neither side could have it. It needed to be reposited where it belonged, in some ethereal divine space. We tried a committee. We tried any number, but the one conclusion I came away with was that and with all due respect to Mr. Trump, this is a real estate deal in only a very narrow sense. It's much more than a real estate deal, but it is real estate. And with real estate, there is this notion of possessing. So I see almost no chance that a way to fix this is to somehow remove sovereignty and reposit it or deposit it in some external authority. You might be lucky enough to have such a body as a sort of administering force symbolically, but I think the problem, as Art, Faith, and Danny have pointed out, with all due respect to the international community, capital I, capital C, this in the end will be a shepherd's war between Israelis and Palestinians in very close proximity to one another. And in that space, they're going to have to be satisfied first and foremost with the resolution.
Yeah, it seems to me, excuse me, it seems to me that if you could imagine a situation in which you could get to that, you could also get to a situation then where the two new state of Palestine and the state of Israel reach an agreement to jointly supervise something. And they would ask third parties to do certain tasks, as the Jerusalem City Initiative suggests, but it's not a passing the baby to the international community to do. It's better to have the parties have some responsibility and authority ongoing, because that also means that they have a stake in it to make it work and will do what they can possibly do with respect to their own citizenries to keep things under control. And just a last comment, it may sound kind of weird, but following up on what the rabbi told me and Michael Bell a few years ago, the way the religious sites in Jerusalem are run now is actually pretty good. I know there are a lot of people that aren't happy with it, but it works pretty well. There's probably there's the issue, of course, of Israelis who think, we're sovereign here, we run the place, why can't we do more? And cooler heads so far prevailed. But there is the ongoing issue of I think, increasing requests or demands for a site for Jews for prayer on the Haram al-Sharif. And so far that has been turned aside, but I think that's a pocket full of dynamite.
Very quickly, I mean, I'm a bit more maybe optimistic on this one, in the sense that I think there's a lot, there's something in what you're saying. It's almost human nature. If I can get it, at least she can't get it either. So there is some satisfaction in this. However, the problem that I see in a lot of this conversation is that these are the kind of decisions that will not be made until, I think you mentioned it, Danny, the very last minute. And you will not hear any indication from either side about willingness to even budge on their opening position until the very last minute. I think our job, in this sense, as experts, as even negotiators, is to prepare the menu of options for that last very minute, all the ones that we can think as realistic options, but have no illusion that we will get any indication which of these will actually be how it's going to end. I suspect the leaders themselves do not know how they're going to decide until they get to that very last moment.
Very quickly.
Last word.
Yeah.
Last word.
I want to relate to all 3 points. Israelis and Palestinians have not been blessed with Scandinavian temperaments. My friend Shlomo Gazit, the former head of Israeli intelligence, said, I never liked Oslo because I never knew if it was a marriage or a divorce. Israelis and Palestinians are heading for a divorce. I participated in the Josie group. I was a gadfly. I love them. I don't rule out the possibility. I think it unlikely because Jerusalem is to be possessed and not shared. I think we're going to have to head politically to a primitive binary division of territorial sovereignty. And no, this is such a visceral conflict, such a possessive conflict, and it is at its peak. We will not be satisfied, not Israelis nor Palestinians, by turning this over to a clueless Norwegian. Sorry, just not going to happen. Having said that, I want to go to your point about the potential trade-off. And again, this may be fantasy, but look, you deal with grueling issues every once in a while, you're entitled to a fantasy. That out on the last day of negotiations, there are two radioactive issues in this conflict. They're both identity politics of the highest order. One is Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif, and the other is the right of return. And there is a parallel between the two of them. And I can anticipate a situation of a trade-off between these two issues. And it would go as follows. We Israelis insist that we have a deep connection to the Temple Mount. And we insist and will achieve ironclad guarantees that will provide us access within the existing status quo. But for the sake of the highest good, we will suspend irrevocably until the Messiah comes our right to implement our rights on the Temple Mount and waive it towards either Palestinian, Arab, or Muslim sovereignty in exchange for we Palestinians have a right of return. We have been historically wronged, and we insist on receiving, I think we discussed it at the time, recognizing that Israel is in some way complicit in the creation of the national tragedy of the Palestinians without Israel itself being a sin that needs to be atoned for. But we, for the sake of a higher good, will irrevocably waive our right of return to Israel, except in a very symbolic way, and implement a right of return to Palestine, restitution, and things of that nature. And the trade-off between the two, is that possible? We will only know on the final day when everything else is resolved, and even then, it will be cut out of the flesh of the kind of leaders that history no longer produces.
On that wonderfully uplifting note, let's conclude, and I want, please join me in thanking Art, Rafe, and Danny. And thank all of you. Danny, thank you. Rafe, that was good. Terrific.
Sir. It's nice to visit the comic every now and then.
Well, it is. Thanks. Good to see you again.